Suppose you live in an apartment building and you have 2 cars, but only 1 parking spot. But there's a neighbor of yours who has a parking spot with no car, and they're never visited by anybody either. So it's a vacant parking spot. May you use your neighbor's unused parking spot? Would the law allow access to that unused parking spot? We'll get back to that on the other side of today's Torah view. The reason we bring this up is because of the very, very dramatic episode recorded in this week's Torah portion of the destruction of the cities of Sdom, consisting of 5 cities in the plain of Sdom, in advance of which God informs Abraham, of the impending destruction of Sdom, saying, can I possibly hide from him what I am about to do? Which in and of itself is interesting. Why does God feel compelled to tell Avraham about the destruction of Sdom? It's not where he lived. It's not his business. Why does God feel compelled to share that with him? Furthermore, what then ensues is a negotiation, what some see as the first Jewish attorney exercising a defense, and that is Avraham speaking up to God and asking him to spare the residents of Sdom, which is also interesting. Of course, his nephew lives there, but he's talking in the defense of the entire residents of Sdom. And God says, no, it's irredeemable, and it's got to be wiped out. So then starts the negotiation. Avraham says, well, what's about if there's 50 righteous people? God says, for 50 righteous people, I'll spare them. So, well, maybe I should go for 40. How about 40? God says, for 40 I will. And he goes from 40 to 30 to 20 to 10, realizing that there's not even 10 among the 5 cities that make up for the Sodom and Gomorrah region. At that point, Avraham realizes he has no aces left in his arsenal, and God is going to proceed with the destruction. Very interestingly. So why did he start off with a 50 and then go down to 40 and 30? Because there were 5 cities there, and the case that he was making was, if there were 10 righteous people in each one of these cities, would that be enough to warrant their redemption or not being destroyed? God said yes, but they weren't, and so they were destroyed. In a very interesting insight and interpretation as to these negotiating points that Avraham was using, some of the commentators say that the number 50 was actually representative also of the days from the 1st of Elul till the last day of Sukkot, which are days of repentance and returning to God. And Avraham was turning to the redemptive power of those days and saying, well, if they would engage in teshuvah, in repentance, throughout that entire period, would you spare them? God said, yes, but they're not engaging. So, well, then what's about 45 days? And that would be from the 1st of Elul till the 1st day of Sukkot. And then he goes down to 40 days, which is from the 1st of Elul until Yom Kippur. And then 30 days, which is just the month of Elul itself, from the 1st of Elul to Rosh Hashanah. And then 20 days from Rosh Hashanah till the last day of Sukkot, Hashanah Rabbah. And then finally 10 days, the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur. God says, yes, if they would turn to me just during that 10-day period, that enough would be sufficient for me to spare them. And when Avraham realized that they weren't even there, they weren't even prepared for 10 days of return, he backed off and the destruction ensued. So the question here is one of Avraham's intervention, but also going back to the question of why God engaged him in the first place. God knew full well that there were not enough people there, not even 10 among the whole 5 cities, that were righteous enough to spare them. So why would have God allowed Avraham into a negotiation when he knew up front that it wasn't going to be fruitful? So we need to peel back another layer of the story here, and that is, what exactly was the sin that was so apparently irredeemably egregious that called for the destruction of Sodom. The Torah is actually not explicit about that. But once again, if we dig a little bit more deeply into the subtlety of the phraseology and the verbiage, we can find some hints and allusions as to what was happening. So the Torah says that the sin, their sin, the collective sin of the entire population of Sodom and Gomorrah reached up to God. And then the Torah talks about her cry, and then her cry, singular, reached up to the heavens, and that was the tipping point for God. What was her cry? Our sages tell us it was the story of a girl who helped a poor person who had made their way into Sodom with a little bit of food, for which she was tortured to death in such an incredibly cruel way. Her body was slathered with honey, and she was exposed, and bees came, and she died a very, very painful and torturous death. And when God saw that, he said, that's it. That's the point of no return. And that was the flashpoint. To what? To the overall attitude of the residents of Sodom. The attitude was one in which each person enjoys complete and total entitlement to what they have, and no one has the moral obligation to share any of their resources with anyone else. And so a poor person had no place in Sodom. There was this constant fear and phobia that everything that I have, I must keep to myself, that somehow sharing with another will deplete my resources. And there was this phobia of scarcity and also of entitlement. As it says in the Mishnah, a person who says, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, that is the attitude of Sodom. This idea of every person as an individual who bears absolutely no responsibility toward another, to God is an anathema to what being a part of humanity and of the family of nations is all about, which means that we are all part of one humanity, we share one planet, and we all are mutually responsible for the other. And the truth is that anyone who has succeeded in life and enjoys wealth, and may many more people enjoy wealth. No one gets to enjoy wealth without the engagement of others, whether they are employees or consumers. So it's in the best interest of the wealthy that everyone is supported, that everybody has basic resources, because everybody is interdependent economically. And if there is no buying power amongst the population, if consumers have no buying power, then the wealth of the wealthy is also depleted. So even from an economic standpoint, we are interdependent. So then to accumulate wealth to the point where one feels that one is exclusively entitled to that undermines a core value of humanity and a core ethos of morality, and that is the responsibility that we all carry toward each other. And Sodom had reached the absolute nadir of this attitude of exclusivity and entitlement, and it had reached the tipping point where it was irredeemable at that point. So here's the interesting thing of how God then engages Avraham. But before we get to that, lest we think that that was an attitude that was prevalent in Sodom, but we have evolved beyond that, we first need to bear in mind that everything recorded in the Torah is recorded because of its eternal relevance. And this mindset of entitlement, what's mine is mine, and I have no obligation to share with you, and by taking that further, I am entitled to live life in a way that I take care of myself, and you are not my problem or my business, has reared itself in very, very ugly ways, even contemporary society. Not that long ago, there was a story that shook up first New York City and then the whole country. That was the case of the murder of Kitty Genovese, or Genovese. She was an Italian-American. And in the early hours of March 13th, 1964, Kitty, a 28-year-old bartender, was stabbed outside the apartment building where she lived in the Kew Garden neighborhood of Queens in New York. 2 weeks after the murder, the New York Times published an article claiming that 38 witnesses saw or heard the attack and that none of them called the police or came to her aid. The incident prompted inquiries into what became known as the bystander effect, or the Genovese Syndrome, and the murder became a staple of U.S. psychology textbooks for the next 4 decades. I'm reading now from Wikipedia. There are then reports that maybe the New York Times reporting was not entirely accurate. So whether it's entirely accurate or even just partially accurate, there is certainly truth to the story wherein people are witness even to a crime and do not intervene. And in worst cases, today, let's see it as an opportunity to create the next viral video. And this didn't only happen in New York. A similar story happened in Israel in May of 2009. A young girl by the name of Yasmin Feingold was rowing in the Yarkon River, and it also became a symbol of indifference in Israeli society, with dozens of onlookers saw her capsized boat. I'm reading from a Haaretz article, did nothing except for calling the police until a 62-year-old man by the name of Avi Toibin acted in true bravery and swam to her rescue. Feingold has since become a symbol of determination and courage after undergoing a long and arduous recovery process before returning to competition and being crowned once more as Israel champion 4 years ago. That's from an article from October of this year. In fact, Israel had previously enacted a law called Lo Ta'amod Al Dam Re'acha, do not stand idly by your brother's blood, making it illegal to be oblivious to another person's life-threatening situation, albeit with the provision that engaging does not actually endanger your life in the process. American law has no such provision. There is no law that stipulates that one must engage to save another person's life. Israeli law does provide for that. And that derives directly from what we witness in this week's Torah portion of Avraham's engagement and attempt at defending the lives of a population of people who were depraved in the eyes of God, whom he didn't even know, and yet he felt the compulsion and he felt the burden of responsibility to his fellow man to stand up and speak up in their defense. And this is why God engaged him, even though God knew from the outset that the negotiation would not end with the salvation of Sodom and Gomorrah because it had reached the point of irredeemability. But God wanted it to be recorded in the Torah, that this is what it means to be a Jew. This is what Avraham stands for. Stands for not only Avraham as the first Jew, but what it means to be a Jew is to feel a tremendous sense of responsibility for humanity, for the world at large. We are all the stewards of God's garden. To not be indifferent to the plight and to the pain and to the suffering of another. That is what Avraham stood for. And that, by the way, is why Avraham is the first Jew and not Noach. Because Noach was told that the entire world is going to be destroyed, not just 5 cities. And while he did build an ark to protect himself and his family, and did inform whoever asked him why he was building the ark as to why he was doing it, he did not actively engage in an effort to spare the world. He didn't speak up to God in defense of humanity and try to find some pathway to save them. And so Noach did not create that type of ethos wherein the sanctity of human life trumps all else, and we must do whatever we can within our power to preserve it and to respect it and to perpetuate it. So, to go back to our opening question, American law, civil law would say that if I have a parking space that belongs to me, even though I don't use it, I never use it, I have the right to tell you who have 2 cars that you have no right to use my parking space. Jewish law would say otherwise. In Jewish law, there is the law of ze nehene v'ze lo chaser. If one person can benefit, and it is not to the detriment of another, it is considered to be a sodomite type of attitude, to simply be exclusionary and to preclude somebody else from doing something that does not in any way compromise myself and my possession or impede on it, just because it may not be legislated in American civil law. But Jewish law finds this morally repugnant and would not allow for that, because that is, again, the great legacy of mutual, not only mutual responsibility, but sensitivity toward another, and the sense that we are all in this world together. We are all living one life at one time in one world, and we all have a responsibility towards one another to not only not harm or impede the other, but to behave in a way that respects another person, respects their possession, respects their interests, and in that way we will all find ourselves living in a much more harmonious, peaceful, and loving world. And that's a better world for all of us, and that is a great gift that Avraham Avinu has bequeathed to each and every one of us. But it's a gift that we have to unpack and exercise and implement and apply in our own lives. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of Torah View. Wishing you a Shabbat Shalom, and please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Storm the World TV.
Rabbi, I'll be a nest, I'll be your bright light, I'll be your miracle, I'll be your miracle of light, I'll be a nest, I'll be your bright light, I'll be your miracle, I'll be your miracle of light, I'll be a nest, I'll be your miracle.